So a rather enormous Space Marine preview today. We finally get a bit more lowdown as to how the divergent chapters are going to be fitting in with their own detachments and keywords. Plus we've got army rules for the Blood Angels and Space Wolves, Dark Angels, Deathwatch and Black Templars. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this one we're going through Games Workshop's preview as to how the more divergent Space Marine chapters are going to be playing. They've lumped them all together into one big article, as it still seems they're a little bit halfway to being Space Marine supplements as opposed to full factions in their own right. Let's talk about how they work, and then go through all the previewed rules, including their detachment rules and shown off datasheets. So the armies that they're talking about are the Blood Angels, Black Templars, Space Wolves, Deathwatch and Dark Angels, which no matter how they decided to implement them would always be handled a little bit weirdly in 10th edition. They have a few different options with their detachment system. It was going to be interesting to see where they fell on that. They're kind of halfway towards being Space Marine supplements, but have their own extra units and things, so are kind of hard to design from a game balance point of view, but it looks like Games Workshop's gone down the route of treating them basically like their own factions in 10th edition 40k, but obviously ones with lots of rules overlaps with the standard Space Marine ones. Each of them are going to be getting their own data card packs when the 10th edition main rules drop, and it does look like they'll all be getting their own codexes in time as well. The Dark Angels are going to be having theirs early in spring 2024, I believe. For these guys, it looks like the way that they're implementing them is their faction rule will remain Oath of Moment, so that's the Great Big Space Marine reroll one. Target one enemy unit out of the enemy's army, get massive rerolls against it, both to hit and to wound, and it's absolutely brutal against any one hard target, say a massive Imperial Knight or Great Big Terminator Death Star. I can't say it's my favourite rule in 10th edition, just seems massively swingy depending on whether your opponent has one of those big targets. It's not going to matter all that much if your opponent's fielding a whole load of small stealth units, things that if you catch them then you'll likely be able to kill them anyway. I think this maybe has some pros and cons for being the main rule for all the sub-factions. On the negatives, it doesn't really add any sub-faction flavour. It does mean that all of them are a little bit more unified under the banner of Space Marines. I'd probably say that the Oath of Moment rule is a little bit less useful for melee armies compared with range. Range damage is just very predictable as to how you can apply it. For combat, you might well declare your Oath of Moment against one given enemy unit, and then not know whether or not you're even going to make the charges successfully to get into combat with it. It's also a bit harder to focus fire with like half your army against one enemy unit with Oath of Moment if your entire army is melee. However though, it definitely seems like a strong rule, and it does help prevent some power discrepancies between the different chapters. Say for example, if Games Workshop didn't give these Oath of Moment and then gave them their own bespoke rules, it might mean that one of those, say Blood Angels, might get a rule that's far weaker than Oath of Moment, and then nobody wants to play them. At least this one means that there's some sort of balance between the Space Marine factions before you add in detachments and things. To actually give the armies their sub-faction flavour though, they basically get that through their launch detachments. They'll each get one. They have their own datasheets that are locked to that faction still, and then presumably when their codexes come out, they'll gain other detachments. They might even mess with the Oath of Moment army rule for all we know. For the ways that you can field these, I think that Games Workshop kind of loosely explained these, maybe didn't go through the entire process blow by blow, but I feel like there's enough from their free text to get the general gist of it. It seems like in their launch indexes, each of these 5 chapters will get a launch detachment. These all have some restrictions as to what you can field in them, more so than the other Space Marine one, the Gladius Force, and in addition to that, extra flavour should be added via their detachment rule, the enhancements that you can pick up, and the 6 stratagems, none of which we've seen so far and will be quite important. They didn't explicitly confirm it in this article, but I think that any of these successor chapters would also be able to make use of that Gladius Strike Force, the more generic combat company that just about any Space Marine chapter can field, the one with the doctrines that give them movement buffs basically. So far from what we've seen, the Gladius Strike Force just requires that you have an Adeptus Astartes army. It seems that all of the units in these armies are Adeptus Astartes, including things like the Deathwing Terminators or the Hounds of Morkai, so it looks like there's no reason you wouldn't be able to field them in that Gladius Force. They also did mention that in interviews as well previously, so I'd guess for an army like Blood Angels you'd have the choice of fielding them in their own detachment here or in the Gladius at launch, maybe more options than most armies get. As for restrictions though, each of these 5 new detachments will limit the sort of units that you can bring, basically meaning that you can't take unique stuff from other chapters. So say the Blood Angels launch detachment will allow you to take the vast majority of units from Codex Space Marines, but it wouldn't allow you to take anything with say the Space Wolves keyword or the Dark Angels keyword, so you can't fill the unique datasheets like say Deathwing Terminators or Ragnar Blackmane in the Blood Angels force. That kind of makes sense, and it sounds like they're still going to have some other restrictions on things that you can and can't field. For For example, no Black Templar librarians, I'd guess probably no Space Wolf apothecaries as well, and I'd imagine Deathwatch might have some things that they can't field, seeing as they don't usually field things like tactical marines. We've not seen those restriction lists yet, but I guess we'll find out later. Also, something that they hinted at but didn't really 100% confirm is that I suspect that you can't mix different chapter keywords within the same army. I suspect that this one's going to be declared on each Space Marine detachment, so say you couldn't have Ultramarines keyword units running around with Imperial Fist ones. I don't think that you're going to be able to field big Astartes Super Friends here. That would at least make sense to me. I suspect it'll be in the rules in some place, but again they didn't really 100% confirm that in the article for things like the Gladius Force. Kind of interestingly, what does sound de-restricted is that it sounds like you could potentially run, say, a Blood Angels painted army and use the Dark Angels detachment for it if you really wanted to, if it somehow fit your lore or tactics better. Sounds like Games Workshop's trying to distance paint from rules in 10th edition somewhat, so I guess there wouldn't be a lot of restrictions to doing that, other than personal pride if you don't want to. You could just use entirely generic Space Marine models within that range, not use any of their unique units or unique characters, and then basically just run them under Dark Angels rules. Effectively, you're just using the Dark Angels Unforgiven Strike Force, and scheme that they're painted in will be somewhat irrelevant. I'd guess that maybe some events and tournaments might still ban that. Games Workshop has usually had that rule where if your army is painted as Ultramarines, it needs to be run as Ultramarines in some way. I guess this probably isn't really a big change to the status quo though. Plenty of people paint up their armies as more generic successors and then can jump between chapter rules if they want to. I suppose in the age of detachments it's perhaps even easier to do that, given that there's no actual keywords attached to them, beyond things like special characters and unique units. Finally, for Space Marine Army Organisation, we also got a hint as to how some minor successor chapters might be realised, and in general it does look like they're losing a fair bit more rule support compared with 9th edition, though I think that was pretty much expected. For example, if you're running Gabriel Seth out of the Flesh Tearers, the only Flesh Tearers type rule that he has basically means that if you run this guy, you can't run any other Blood Angels epic hero models, so you can't run him alongside, say, Dante or Mephiston. I guess that works quite well for any armies that only have a limited amount of special characters, and if they're fairly sure that they don't want to release any Flesh Tearers characters anytime soon. Basically, it sounds like if you're running a Blood Angels army, you'll still be running with their launch detachment and their damage buff in close combat. You could take any of their unique special units, and then when it came down to epic heroes, you'd either have the choice of taking Seth or taking the rest of the mix of them, as with now. Let's get into the rules of these chapters though, and first up we have the rules for the Space Wolves. Looks like the launch detachment for the Sons of Russ is the Champions of Russ detachment, and the main rule that they get is sagas, basically trying to have their characters do certain deeds throughout the game, and then if they do manage those deeds rather than just a character buff, they get an entire army-wide buff now. It's kind of interesting that these deeds that each have their own challenges are now going to be super important whether they go off or not. It's one thing having a boosted warlord trait, it's quite another thing having a special rule acquired by the entire Space Wolf army that's really going to level them up later in the game. The way they work is that you can only activate one of them at the end of each battle round, even if you did happen to do multiple deeds worthy of saga, and the fact that these are all character triggered means that Space Wolf lists are almost certainly going to want to go very heavily on characters. If you've got a fair few dangerous melee characters running around, then hopefully you'll have a fair few more chances to actually take down the enemy units in the way that they need to and trigger these boosts. It does look like from these rules that they don't actually start with any intrinsic melee boost, but two of the sagas that you can unlock do ramp up their units in melee and not at range, so I still think that they're going to skew more to close combat units as opposed to shooting ones. I feel like while it's a fun rule and really quite evocative, I must admit it's going to be pretty frustrating for Space Wolf players starting with basically no special rule from their detachment, and then I'd say literally all of these are at least somewhat unreliable or situational. In a lot of games it just might not be in the Space Wolf players' control whether or not they can do them, and that maybe isn't exactly the best news for them. It's also interesting that this will be way better in bigger games than smaller games. You'll have more characters running around and basically more chances to have these deeds go off with more enemy units. In smaller games where you might only have one or two characters, there's just going to be a lot less chance for doing these deeds. Talking of the sagas though, basically each of these has a challenge and a reward. I say the challenge is situational for literally all of these, but in every case the reward is pretty meaningful. Warrior Born is to kill a character model with one of your characters. I guess ideally get your character into combat with an enemy unit with a leader, maybe use that epic challenge stratagem and try and take them down with precision maybe. If you can pull that off, then your entire army gets sustained hits 1 for all melee weapons, a massive flat boost to Space Wolf combat from there on out. The Saga of Majesty is a hard one to achieve, Not only do you somehow have to wrest control of an objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone at the end of your turn, but when you do so, you also have to have a character model within range of that objective, and I feel like that's not going to happen until really quite late game most of the time. Often you'd have to blast through your opponent's army and actually reach the objective by killing most of them, or unless they just happen to have left their objective really exposed and maybe prone to a deep strike charge or something. If you achieve it, you get +1 objective control across your entire army. It will be meaningful some of the time, but not always. I feel like this one's a particularly hard one to achieve, and maybe the reward for it isn't as overwhelming as some of the rest. Saga of the Bear is one that's just going to happen situationally every so often. Basically, if your Adeptus Astartes character gets reduced below half wounds over the course of the battle round, but isn't destroyed by the end of it, then he can activate a army-wide Feel No Pain of 6+, really quite a nice defensive boost to have. Again, this one feels somewhat dependent on your opponent. A lot of the time, if they get to attack your characters, they'll almost certainly want to wipe them out if they can, but sometimes some lucky invul saves might have them just cling to life. Again, not super reliable, but maybe if you've got multiple big super stompy frontline characters on the go, maybe Beyond the Fell-Handed, and perhaps Logan Grimnar and Stormrider, you might have a bit more chance of pulling this off. Finally, we've got Saga of the Beast Slayer. This one's going to be reliable against some armies, but not against others. This one goes off if one of your character models decides to kill an enemy monster or vehicle, and if they achieve that, then melee weapons in your army get lethal hits. Lethal hits is absolutely great against vehicles, and I feel like this one might be one that somewhat reliably triggers against armies like knights. They're going to have loads of vehicles around, so there's a lot more chance of one of your characters killing one, and then when the buff happens, it's going to be massively effective against the rest of their army. Again, for this one in particular, I feel like Beyond the Fell-Handed could be an interesting choice for this, a character model that can pack a twin las cannon. That's definitely got the potential to kill a vehicle at range, and maybe get this one going super early. Overall, I feel like these feel quite fun and evocative for the Space Wolves. I do feel like they're going to be very swingy though, and very situational. I feel like the one for killing monsters and vehicles is probably going to be the most reliable in certain matchups, the rest perhaps a bit more niche. Space Wolf armies are almost certainly going to be swimming in characters though. If you can unlock these buffs, it's going to give your army some serious boosts going forward, and you could get a stack of them rolling towards the end of the game whenever the stars align. Otherwise, for the Space Wolves, we've got a datasheet preview in the Hounds of Morkai. Out of all of the Space Wolf units they could have chosen to show off, the Hounds of Morkai are certainly one of them. The Hounds of Morkai are basically Reavers with a Space Wolf upgrade sprue, their attack counters basically being anti-Psyker Space Wolves, and to be fair to them, they do actually have a fair few more interesting rules than they used to. It looks like they actually have some serious bite in close combat and shooting, as all their attacks get devastating wounds somehow. The stat line's fairly as expected. They've gained a 6+ invul save that's not going to be relevant too often besides against melter weapons, but it gets to improve to a 4+ against psychic attacks, so a bit more resilient there. They're scouts with a 6-inch move rule. Maybe that might be somewhat common to other Reavers and things, and they have the smoke keyword as well, so they could get the benefit of cover and -1 to hit for the drop of a stratagem. The models are armed with their bolt pistol and combat blade, basically keeping with the mass volume of low strength 4 attacks with not much AP. What's interesting though is the cluster of special rules that they have on them that do make them actually quite scary. Perhaps most interestingly, they have devastating wounds, so whenever you roll a 6 to wound, that'll be a mortal wound instead, and that's pretty relevant on low AP. It actually makes them somewhat worth dealing damage against heavier targets with. They should chip off a bit each turn. They then pair that with Anti-Psyker 4+, so if they can get in range of something like a Tyranid Hive Tyrant or an enemy Psyker character, that's going to be a really big deal indeed, and they also have the Precision keyword as well, meaning that they can easily rip an enemy Psyker right out of a unit if they get a charge on them. In melee, they are legitimately very brutal against Psychic units. They'll average around about 6 or 7 mortal wounds on a Psychic character within a unit if 5 models do survive to make a charge. 20 attacks hitting on a 3 and then a mortal wound on every 4 is pretty mad. If they do charge a unit with a Librarian or Weird Boy in, then that character is almost certainly dead. Finally, they have the Howl of Morkai as well. This one's a Battle Shock debuff within 12 inches. It goes up to 18 inches instead if you've thrown a Lieutenant in there, and if it's failed for a Psychic unit, they get -1 to hit with their Psychic attacks, which might be more or less relevant depending on what you've hit. Throwing around a bit more Battle Shock definitely doesn't hurt though. Overall, just from the datasheet, these guys seem a lot more exciting than they were in their previous incarnation, I think. They won't do anything to mess with psychic abilities now though, but at least the enemy can't just laugh off their low AP attacks, as they do get some mortal wounds out of them. Moving on, we've got the Blood Angels, and their launch detachment is appropriately the Sons of Sanguinius detachment, their detachment rule being Red Thirst. This one's changed the tune a little bit on the previous rule. Previously, Blood Angels had a +1 to wound in the first round of melee. That does appear to be gone, and they've also lost their +1 to advance and charge that they had innately, which was really quite a nice boost to getting into combat, particularly if they came in via Deep Strike. Hopefully they'll retain something to make their charges from the sky a little bit more reliable. The new Red Thirst rule though I still think is pretty good. You get +1 strength and +1 to your attacks characteristic, but only on the charge, so you don't get it if you're charged anymore. So it's not going to be quite as brutal for enemy units that are trying to get into combat with you. Compared with the +1 to wound, I think it's somewhat balanced to be honest. Gaining a pip of strength in 10th edition 40k is a lot worse than getting +1 to wound. A lot of the time it just won't matter at all whatsoever, particularly with a lot of vehicles being say toughness 11 or 12 or 13. It won't matter if you go from strength 4 to strength 5 against them, but it would have mattered quite a lot if you got a +1 to wound. I feel like it's most likely to be relevant when you've got a lot of low strength attacks hitting enemy infantry, particularly things when you've got strength 4 or 5 attacks going into toughness 4, 5 or 6 units. That's a bit more likely to actually make a change on the wound chart. +1 attack is always relevant though, kind of keeps the spirit of their combat doctrine. That's usually going to be an extra 25 to 33% damage for most units when they charge in, which is still very good indeed. When both of these apply, it will generally be better than the old chapter tactic alone. Effectively, you get +1 to wound and also the +1 attack even if you're in early game, but a lot of the time the strength won't make a difference. Seems solid enough to me, but it will mean that Blood Angels units don't punch up quite as hard against really tough things, maybe particularly units like Sanguinary Guards that really like the +1 to wounds to basically wound everything on 4s before. For the unit previews, we've got a look at the Death Company Intercessors, which I think are kind of interesting as they show off the new Black Rage. The stat line of them is pretty similar, and it looks like they do retain the 6+ feel no pain type rule that they had, so they'll still be a little bit harder to kill with things like damage to weapons compared with most Space Marines. Black Rage still looks very solid to me. Even if you haven't charged or anything, you basically always get to re-roll your hit roll, which is a massive damage boost and stacks very nicely with the +1 attack. Even just for standard guys with bolt guns here, you'd typically be hitting with 4 attacks on the charge, all at strength 5 and re-rolling the hit roll. That's definitely going to be pretty threatening against just about any light or medium infantry that the enemy has. Obviously gets better if they get the extra attack from the Astartes chainsword which they can take. That extra bit of AP is good. For the downside of the Black Rage, it looks like that's now entirely mitigated if you get a chaplain nearby. If you don't have a chaplain nearby though, then they can't hold objectives, their objective control 0, and they're not allowed to fall back from the enemy units, which could be quite disruptive. I feel like in reality that's probably going to put a lot of people off taking these unless you do happen to have a chaplain around. Generally in 40k you do need to be taking objectives quite a bit. I'd say that's probably the biggest issue out of the two, as they kind of like to be in combat. Perhaps the most surprising rule on this one though is their Visions of Heresy. This one seems like really quite a powerful rule on top of Black Rage, where it basically means they get to either freely overwatch or heroic intervene each turn, and they can use that stratagem for effectively 0 CP. Heroic intervention is a bit situational. It's very nice if it ever gets them into melee, but basically requires the opponent to charge one of your units within 6 inches of you, so it's kind of predictable and preventable on their part. However though, I'd say probably the most interesting thing is basically free overwatch every single turn. You can use that one now whenever the opponent ends or starts a move or when enemies come in from the reinforcement phase. In theory, if you had a 10 model unit of these, you could have them all with bolt rifles and maybe one with the Astartes grenade launcher. In theory that could be up to 5 shots of 20 shot bolt rifles hitting on 6s basically for free. You're only going to be landing around about 3 or 4 hits each time you do fire that off unless you get rerolls, but even that is pretty potent if you happen to be able to target enemy units with light infantry and low saves just before they deal damage. Say if you had some Eldar Aspect Warriors emerge from reserve or something, you could light them up for absolutely free with these guys if they're within 24 inches, maybe kill a couple of crucial models before they inflict damage on you at no command point cost. Seems a bit random, maybe not the biggest deal in the world against enemies with heavy units, but could be pretty disruptive to some. I did notice as well that the bolt rifle on these guys does seem to be a bit worse than standard intercessors. The standard intercessors get the heavy and the assault keywords, so that means they can fire them at full accuracy after advancing, and they hit on a 2+ if they stay still. The Death Company get none of that, as presumably they're a bit less disciplined and a bit more full of rage. They just get the bolt rifle with its standard stats. Otherwise, for new war gear that we haven't seen yet, looks like the heavy bolt pistol looks pretty similar with its AP -1 and 18-inch range, and the Astartes grenade launcher looks like it's had the same amount of buffs as the guard one. The frag one seems a little bit weaker but does have the new blast keyword, which is kind of fun, but the crack one is the exciting one. A single shot at strength 9, AP 2 and damage D3 actually has a lot more bite than it ever used to. Feels a lot more like a meaningful special weapon in the unit rather than something that's barely better than a bolt rifle. Overall seems pretty interesting. I feel like the actual Death Company datasheet might still be a little bit more fun than this, given that they'll have all access to the more fancy power weapons and things, but I feel like their melee damage buff looks pretty efficient, and just random Overwatch fired all game long seems kind of good as well. Finally, we've got the datasheet for Gabriel Seth himself. As mentioned, he's got that interesting Successor Chapter rule. You basically have to choose between him and the other Blood Angels epic heroes if you're going to be including him in a Blood Angels army. And it looks like the choice of units that he can lead is pretty limited as well. It seems to be literally just the Assault Squad, Command Squad, Tactical Squad, and Vanguard Veteran Squad. Looks like he's not going to be touching those Primaris, who he seems to be famously annoyed by. I was kind of wondering whether this guy might actually wind up going to Legends. Games Workshop has done that with quite a lot of other models they've removed from their web store, but so far no hint of that yet. Fingers crossed he'll get a fully fledged datasheet within Codex Blood Angels and will be treated the same way as poor Yarrick. Otherwise though, he's basically a dedicated melee beast now. Looks like Chapter Masters don't give you any innate damage boost at all. He's not throwing full rerolls either on his unit or on a nearby Dreadnought or anything. The two things that he has is basically Advance and Charge for the unit that he's leading, which is fairly meaningful I suppose. Definitely increases the threat range of say something like some Vanguard Veterans. I suppose you might even be able to have him leading a unit of Jump Pack ones and chain him back slightly. That could have a unit that's got really quite a lot of charge threat range. Otherwise, basically, he's just a dedicated melee beast that does some pretty punchy attacks. 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 3, and he gets an extra attack for every 5 enemy models within 6 inches of him. If you're charging into a big unit or a mass formation, he could easily get 1 or 2 that way. Overall, I'd still say that he's probably not quite as general purpose as he was before, won't be punching up against vehicles quite as hard with only Strength 8, and a lot of the full rerolls I think is quite a big nerf. Looks like he doesn't have any innate stratagem thing that a fair few of the other captains look like they get. That looked like it was more major incentive for the Leviathan Terminator captain. Moving on to the Zealous Crusaders of the Black Templars, here we have the Templar Vows as their main detachment rule, and it looks like their launch detachment is called Righteous Crusaders. This one's got a kind of similar look and feel to the previous rule for it. Basically you have 4 different vows that you choose pre-game, and you get to choose one of these depending on how much it's going to help against the enemy's army. I'd guess this means that their chapter tactic is just going outright, no more reroll to charges innately, and no more extra mortal wound protection. The rules that they can pick from are these 4. First up, lethal hits in melee, excellent to choose against knights or heavies, and yet another example of lethal hits army-wide if you want it. Then there's one for a feel no pain of 6+ and leadership of 5+. 2 decent boosts there will definitely make the army a lot harder to kill on the defensive. Maybe if you're playing an army that's got loads of 2 wound models and your opponent had loads of damage too, that could be a particularly nice boost to have, as it stops them killing entire models when you pass one. It doesn't give you an army-wide invul save anymore, but at least it doesn't have any impact on your cover saves now. Next up is the massive anti-psyker one, a 4+ invul against psychic attacks, which I think is okay against some armies, but much more importantly, anti-psyker 4+ on all of your melee weapons. It means that every close combat attack will automatically wound on a 4+, and it'll count as a critical wound for any of your weapons with devastating wounds. That seems absolutely monstrous for any units in the army with Thunderhammers, which get damage 2 and devastating these days. If you're playing against Grey Knights or Thousand Suns, it looks like this one's probably the one to go for. Looks kind of monstrous to play against, but given that a lot of their units are only toughness 4 anyway, sometimes it might even just be better to go for the next one, which is sustained hits 1 in melee weapons. Maybe depends on how much psychic attacks they're going to be throwing at you. Finally, talking of which, sustained hits 1 is a flat damage boost, usually plus 25% damage in melee for things that hit on a 3+. It's basically exploding 6s to hit. This one feels like another decent one to go for if you're unsure. Maybe if you just want extra melee damage and your opponent is neither massive heavy units nor psychers. Anything that you'd rather have extra damage compared with extra durability. Overall, I feel like they all seem usable, there's no real dud ones here. The psyker one and the lethal hits are maybe a little bit more niche than the other two, but it's pretty powerful that you can just pick the one that you think is best depending on the enemy. As most of these affect melee attacks, I guess you'd usually want to build fairly heavily into melee for the Black Templars, so I guess not too much is changing there. Talking of Black Templars melee though, here we have a datasheet for the Sword Brethren. I'd say probably the biggest change for these guys is that they've been boosted from 2 wounds up to 3 wounds. That seems like a sensible decision to me and puts them in line with things like Chaos Chosen in 9th edition, plus Blade Guard Veterans. They already lack the Storm Shield, so I feel like the extra wound is pretty reasonable. The weapons maybe don't seem particularly surprising here. They mainly look like they've got power weapons at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 1. The Swordmaster guy leading the unit gets a slightly boosted profile. He hits on 2s and gets damage 2, so it's quite brutal against Marines infantry there. And it does look like there's no special rules for the lightning claws in here. I guess you just count them as power weapons the same as the rest now. The Sword Brethren do really seem like a very capable melee unit though, mainly due to their special rule Vow Sworn Bladesman. This allows them to flex their damage output a bit depending on whether they're fighting elite infantry or hordes. If they're fighting hordes, then they all pick up +1 attack, usually 25% damage here against hordes, or they can take +1 damage. For all of the regular guys with their power swords, that will put them up to damage 2, so against anything with multi-wounds or 2 wounds, that would basically be double damage for the majority of them. I guess if you were fighting 3-wound infantry, it'd put the sergeant on killing a model every time a save is failed. That's pretty nice. Hopefully these guys will be a little bit stronger in 10th edition. They have been a tiny bit on the underwhelming side in 9th, I think. Moving on from the Black Armoured Space Marines, we come to some Black Armoured Space Marines, and here are the Deathwatch. 40k Xenos Hunting Space Marines get a Black Spear Task Force as their launch detachment, and their detachment rule is called Mission Tactics. Previously, these would give them different Deathwatch rerolls against certain battlefield roles, and also they had their Combat Doctrines thing where they could choose the different combat doctrine each turn these days. The new version of Mission Tactics goes somewhere down the Combat Doctrine type road, basically 3 different buffs that you can activate for your Deathwatch Space Marines. You can only select each one of them once, so I guess that's basically 3 turns of some fairly powerful boosts. I think it's perhaps not impossible that characters might be able to manipulate or influence these though. Perhaps if you've got a Watchmaster on the field, they'll have some sort of rule that interacts with your mission tactics. I feel like that might be a datasheet to watch, no pun intended. Perhaps for less good news for the Deathwatch front though, special issue ammunition seems to be gone entirely from the Deathwatch Veterans datasheet. In 8th edition it was kind of godly, with things like auto wounding on 2 pluses, or extra AP being thrown around. In 9th edition it was massively weaker and just locks to a few bolt weapons, and now it seems to have disappeared entirely. My guess is that they'll probably still have it realised, perhaps as a stratagem, though I guess even the mission tactics rule does kind of keep a little bit of feel of that. Basically your Deathwatch units can flex into different types of extra damage, which feels a little bit along the same lines of special issue. I know at least a fair few Deathwatch players were hoping that it might make a bit of a return in a big way though, but that doesn't really seem to have been the case. As for these mission tactics though, here are the 3 that you can choose from. Fura Tactics, Malleus Tactics, or Purgatus Tactics. Basically flat damage increases, and it looks like it's range and melee as well. A lot of the buffs that we've seen for the other chapters so far have generally been melee locked. These ones look like they've got quite a lot of overlap with the Tyranid selective adaptations that they can do. Again, a lot of things in 40k seem to be handing out either sustained hits or lethal hits as the ways to buff armies. That's quite common across a load of them. First up, the Fura Tactics give you exploding 6s to hit. Again, as with the rest of them that we've talked about, when you hit on 3s, it effectively gives you a 25% boost to damage output. It's not dependent on the wound roll, so it should be fairly flat against everything. I feel like this is one that you usually want to go for when your army is going to be maximally committed, probably turn 2 or turn 3, one of the turns where you really need to deal some hefty damage and overcome the bulk of the enemy army. Really quite cool, this both applies to your heavy weapons and also units that you're charging in with. Then Malleus Tactics is lethal hits on everything, again brutal against knights and tough targets. If you're wounding on a 3+, it's a bit worse than the sustained hits. If you're wounding on a 5+, it's massively better. Usually a 50% damage increase for attacks wounding on a 5 or worse. In particular, this one feels really good if you want to have a turn where your mid-strength type weapons like overcharged plasma really punch up against vehicles. I feel like the frag cannon might like this one a bit too. Then finally we've got the Purgatus Tactics, which seem to be an anti-character one. This one's kind of similar to a rule that the Tyranids have. Critical hits, so usually hit rolls of a 6 become precision, so that means that you could land them on leaders in a unit that's got a character in it. Seems like that's a fairly strong chance to hit characters with meaningful damage that are hiding in units. If your opponent's got a whole ton of those, then this could be a really good one, particularly if those characters aren't particularly hard to kill and are mainly more buffing or support characters. Pretty brutal if you could just lay some heavy weapon fire into a unit and have a reasonable chance of one of the hits landing on the character and killing them dead then and there. Overall, they do seem decently good. I guess you'd be able to weigh up which of these you think is going to be most important in each battle round. For a datasheet preview, we get to see the profile of the Deathwatch veterans made anew. These guys still seem to have the same sort of feel as they had before, a fairly standard Space Marine profile with 3 attacks in combat with their basic weapons, and access to some really quite fun and fancy kit. Looks like their Storm Shields have been renamed Astartes Shields here. This one still gives them a 4+ invul save, though no longer a +1 to their armor save, though it still seems like quite a good durability boost. Otherwise, for their ranged weapons, the frag cannons become 18-inch range, D3 shots, hitting on a 4+, though it's heavy, strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2. It's got the rapid fire D3 keyword, so that means 2 D3 shots within 9 inches I suppose, and blast could land you extra hits on top of that. Doesn't seem awful, but maybe just a touch of a weapon that's kind of hard to use. I guess maybe it might be easiest to get them within that 9-inch range if they're jumping out of a rhino perhaps. Otherwise, they've got some combi weapons that they've renamed long vigil ranged weapons. Just looks like that's a combi weapon by another name there. I'd guess maybe that rolls in the Stalker Bolt rifle. The Infernus Heavy Bolter is a little bit less potent, I'm afraid. That one looks like you now have to choose between either the Heavy Flamer or the Heavy Bolter to make your attacks with. Though I guess that will probably come with a points reduction given the less damage that you're getting out of it. The Heavy Thunderhammer still looks pretty brutal. It hits on a 4+, and it's Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3. Most Thunderhammers are Damage 2 these days. It's also got devastating wounds as well, so on a wound roll of a 6 they become mortals, which is kind of scary against high save stuff. Finally, and perhaps particularly interestingly, is that these guys legitimately seem better against Xenos than other armies now. They've got a built-in hit reroll of 1 going up to 4 hit rerolls against Xenos armies, so they are going to be solidly better against those now compared with just against the field. I guess that's pretty on theme for Deathwatch, maybe not quite so much that it's just going to put them into ludicrous territory against Xenos, but bad against other things. You still have the hit rolls of 1 otherwise. It does look like it's quite nice though for the things that hit on a 4+, like that Heavy Thunderhammer or the Frag Cannon on the move. Overall still seems pretty fun. You can field a lot of them as their battle line. Obviously how strong they are will depend on points. Finally, we come to the Unforgiven forces of the Dark Angels, and they do indeed get their Unforgiven task force. I must admit their detachment rule isn't the most exciting in the world, playing more into their leadership things as opposed to the +1 to hit when static that they previously got. That appears to have gone away. Now the Dark Angels' Grim Resolve is an objective thing. Basically, if you fail Battle Shock, your objective control goes down to 1 instead of 0. So it basically means that they're impossible to stop them scoring objectives with Battle Shock, though it might mean that they have less objective control points if you say do it to some troops or something. I think it is a nice to have, it'll probably net you a few victory points every so often, though I must admit I don't think it's the most exciting rule in the world, and it still doesn't completely negate Battle Shock or anything. You'll still be dealing with the other debuffs that it gives, like not using stratagems, and falling back giving Desperate Escape. Overall, I feel like this is perhaps one of the weaker ones out of the factions that we've seen previewed. It's kind of dependent on your opponents weakening a unit to below half health but not killing it, then you're failing your 6+ leadership test, and if not, then it's just rarely going to have much effect. There are a bunch of other things that hand out Battle Shock in Warhammer 40k, but these generally tend to be during the opposing turn, and your squad basically just heals that automatically before you score objectives normally. I feel like perhaps the main interest for the Dark Angels might well be their unique units, and we have got a preview of their Deathwing command squad, really quite a busy datasheet. These guys have definitely had some big revisions. They've gone to a squad of 5 to 10, and you must take all 3 of the specialists, including the Apothecary, Champion, and the Banner Bearer. These look like they're all rolled into the squad, rather than running around as individual characters now. Previously, the small characters within this all had their own datasheets, so it looks like they won't be joining individual other Deathwing squads now. I feel like we'll probably see similar for things like the Firstborn Command Squad and the Ravenwing Command Squad, though I'd guess that the Primaris individual units will probably still be able to attach to units individually, as things like the Primaris Apothecary and the Primaris Ancient are sold separately. Otherwise though, it looks like for unit equipment, most of the weapon loadouts seem to be very unrestricted. You can still take a full mix of things like the Terminator Assault Squad loadouts with the standard Terminator loadouts, though a few things have been a little bit changed, like you have to keep your Storm Bolter if you've got a Cyclone Missile now. As with that Space Marine Captain datasheet, it looks like the Storm Shield now gives you an extra wound, so if you've got Storm Shields you'll still have that 4+ Imball save, but you'll go up to 4 wounds rather than 3. Otherwise, the rest of the weapons look like they're similar to that Space Marine Captain preview. Things like the Thunderhammers and Power Fists are now a lot more equivalent. It's whether you want to hit on 4s with devastating wounds, or hit on 3s without it. The specialists are all really quite interesting, I think. The Champion gets a nice general purpose melee weapon in their halberd. That's got the precision keyword so it can snipe characters, and he also grants the unit a very nice +1 to advance and charge, and heroic interventions for 0 CP. The Apothecary is allowed to revive 1 slain model per turn. It doesn't look like he grants any sort of feel no pain type save though, but still bringing a Terminator back from the dead is pretty massive I think. And the banner I think is still very relevant for a frontline unit as well. It gives the unit +1 objective control, which is pretty handy for those midfield points. Looks like they can fail Battle Shock, but I guess in the Dark Angels detachment they still have at least some objective control, and just overall they seem like a very well-rounded and pretty powerful force to have moving towards a midfield objective, with a whole load of advantages that you really want on that kind of tough unit. The only thing I'd be a bit apprehensive about for these guys is that Dark Angels are probably getting a model and codex release in 2024. Seems like there's a very good chance they'll be releasing newly upscaled Deathwing Terminators like this, so it might not be the best idea to go buying a whole bunch of these right now. Finally, in a datasheet that I'll try and go through in a full unit review in a few hours' time, we've got Lionel Johnson. The Primarch of the Dark Angels has been reimagined for 10th edition, and Games Workshop do seem to have listened to the fans a bit, and actually made the Emperor's Shield somewhat good at keeping him safe. It's now got a bunch of rules that you'd actually expect it to have from 9th edition. He now has a 3+ invul save, and is just -1 to wound innately, so 2 enormous damage boosts there. He's going to be nigh unkillable for anything that's strength 8 or less, as that'll be wounding him on a 6. Otherwise, his profile is really quite similar to Guilliman's: leadership 5, objective control 4, toughness 9 and an 8-inch move. His melee weapons are very similar to Guilliman's as well. The Lion strikes with pretty similar power against most things. He just gets +1 attack on his strike mode and +2 on his sweep, but that does come at the expense of a bit of strength. Overall pretty monstrous damage. He's going to be a massive menace in close combat. Then, kind of like Guilliman, he gets 3 different auras to choose from, though I'd say that these are maybe a little bit more niche than Guilliman's are. One of Mortal Wound Protection out to 6 inches, they get a 4+ Feel No Pain against that. One for a +1 to hit aura in melee, so that's quite nice if he's charging in alongside some Deathwing maybe. Typically that won't help too much on his profile though, unless he's fighting something with -1 to hit. And then finally a kind of weirdly powerful but also quite niche stratagem debuff. If the enemy uses the stratagem within 12 inches, you've got the option to farm 1 command point from it, and potentially give them a battle shock test that might cost them the stratagem's ability. I guess that is potentially quite disruptive if he is on the front line. I guess the question is whether you pass up mortal wound protection or combat buffs for that, when it's going to be fairly in your opponent's control whether or not they spend stratagems within 12 of him. Overall though, I feel like this is a massive glow up compared with his kind of underwhelming datasheet that he had in 9th. And what's more, they did also talk about his release date as well. Apparently is coming not so very long after Leviathan, so fingers crossed not too much longer to wait. In any case, that really is quite a massive amount of Space Marine rules there. Let me know what you make of the 5 more divergent Space Marine chapters, and which ones you think are shaping up best so far. I think for their pure detachment rules, I feel like the Blood Angels have done okay with that, and the Black Templars and Deathwatch both seem kind of interesting as well, some nice easy access flat damage boosts. Otherwise, Hands of Morkai seem a bit more fun with those devastating wounds compared with what they used to be. The Death Company Intercessors are kind of weird with their free Overwatch thing, plus some mighty melee of their own. I think it's cool that Lionel Johnson has got a datasheet that's a bit more worthy of him. It's very much not all the story though, we don't have points costs and we don't have stratagems and things yet, so I'm sure we'll find out some more in due course. In any case, let me know your thoughts and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'm sure we'll have plenty more rules previews and final reveals in 10th edition to come over the next month or so. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.